Hi, my name is Dan Robinson with the Great Lakes Spirituality Project, and I'm very happy today to be talking to Dr. Christopher Fici. Dr. Fici, well, welcome first. Welcome. Thanks for
Thank
being
you.
here. Dr. Fici holds a PhD in Constructive and Comparative Theology and Religious Studies from Union Theological Seminary in New York City. And he currently teaches at Iona College in New Rochelle, New York. And he also serves as the director of Hinduism and Ecology Society for the Oxford Center for Hindu Studies. For the Mid-Atlantic region of the American Academy of Religion, he serves as the co-chair of the Hinduism Section, as well as the co-chair of the Comparative Religion and Ecology Section. And he's also co-director for the Sacred Ecology Forum at the Bhakti Center in New York City, which is a spiritual center dedicated to sharing the culture and practice of Bhakti Yoga. That's quite a list. You're a busy man.
Need some downtime.
Well, I appreciate you taking some of that downtime and talking with me today. There's a lot based on your background. There's just a lot I'd like to ask you, but I want to start a little bit with your own personal story. I understand that you grew up in Michigan. Is that correct?
Yeah, I was born in Detroit at St. John's Hospital, and I was raised, my family still lives, my mom still lives in Harper Woods, Michigan, which is on the east side of Detroit. My sister lives in Royal Oak, Michigan, and most of my extended family still is around the Metro Detroit area. Some folks also kind of out west to near Kalamazoo.
Oh, okay. Okay. Well, given that that's your background growing up, could you talk a little bit about your own personal experiences and connections with the Great Lakes?
Yeah. So one of the best times of years when my family and we have these family friends, the Krebs, who have these cottages up in Port Austin, Michigan, which is right on the tip of the thumb there. So kind of where Lake Huron and the Saginaw Bay are mixing together. And for many years when I was a kid, we would go there for a summer vacation, and we'd rent out a couple of the cottages that our friends owned, and just we had family friends who had the property next door, and we just had this great week on the beach there, and it was just some of our favorite like childhood memories. And then in the past couple of years, when my sister had her kids, we decided we would try to go back up there. So for the past few years, we've been going up to the cottages in Port Austin, and it's even better, I think when you're an adult, because you realize just how amazing it is. The kids love it. Like both my niece and my nephew are like total water babies, just like I am. And for me, especially, I think what has really become richer for me is just, especially through my kind of just spiritual practice and just through the studies I've been doing, it's just like a really deeper appreciation of the Great Lakes, of Lake Huron, and not just like an intellectual appreciation, but just like I think my happy place in the world is swimming in Lake Huron. That's like my one like a special happy place. So it's very much just I just always tell people the lakes are like probably the greatest natural opulences in this country. And it's interesting too for people. Their idea of a lake is more like a pond, to be frank. Um, and it's amazing when I just get to see people experience the lakes for the first time, because they're just like so awe-inspiring. I mean, they're just their own just universe, basically their own ecosystem.
Sure. So from a spiritual perspective, then, for somebody who hasn't had that experience of spending time by the lakes, how would you describe that, if you could?
Um, in one sense, just kind of like on the kind of like sensual level, it's just feeling very like embraced, feeling. I mean, especially when we're up there July and August, the lakes, it's so comfortable, and it's just like the water temperature is great, and I just feel like very nurtured, in swimming in the lakes. Just feel very just free, taken care of, just so relaxed. It's just this kind of like natural high you get just like swimming in the lakes and coming out and just being in the atmosphere on the beach and everything. And it's just like it really, especially if you're a person who's working hard, and you just feel like your whole being just kind of like kind of just like and we just let go, kind of just swimming in the lakes. And it's just, I can understand completely why people want to spend a lot of money to have properties up there, and I'd love to have a place up there too at some point. But because it just feels very like there's something about human beings have this desire to live near water, and it's just this kind of very, and it might be something related to just like the womb, or it's just something that is just part of our DNA, that we just really like to be connected to the water. And of course, that brings up challenges in a time of climate change when the seas are rising and things like that, but to say the least. But also, I mean, just I think for my own practice as a Hindu, and then also bringing this back to my Catholic side as well, there's a sense that the lakes, water are a place where we can meet the sacred very directly. And in Hindu traditions, people worship these sacred rivers like the Ganges and the Yamuna River with an understanding that these rivers are actually manifestations of divinity, that they're a goddess, and that they can grant us, everything we need for our material and spiritual well-being.
Wow. So sounds like you grew up Catholic and now are part of the Hindu tradition. It sounds like quite a spiritual journey. I kind of want to ask about that, but I also want to ask something a little more specific. And given the work that you've been doing as an academic, how has your own spiritual journey been helped you connect your spirituality to care for the environment?
Um, this year I've been teaching for the first time extensively students at Iona College in New York. We had this course on religion in the natural world, and um, I think sometimes when I take a step back and look at how I'm teaching, it's a little different from how I think other teachers teach, because I try to really, as much as I want the students to learn kind of in an intellectual space, I'm also, and I feel this is part of just kind of my spiritual vocation, as it were. We're learning things around like Pope Francis and the Thomas Berry, who is this really important Catholic thinker, historian of religions, who talked about just like how we need to reconnect to the universe to really understand our spiritual experience and reconnect to the elements. And of course, that's something that traditions have been doing since the beginning of time. And we've, especially those of us kind of coming from like Western or European backgrounds, we've lost some of that sense. So and of course, when you're teaching, you have to, even a place like Iona, which is kind of a Catholic school, you got to be a little careful going full on this kind of spirituality. But I see in my students, these younger students, they have such like an earnest desire to understand, and many of them are also very spiritual in and of themselves. So it's always this kind of deep theme behind the work that I do as a scholar. Thankfully, I get to do more directly theological work. And then, in my teaching, I'm just blessed to be in a place that also encourages kind of spiritual and religious experience. And then a place where I'm following in the footsteps of my mentor, Sister Kathleen Degnan, who taught at Iona for many years, and taking on her religion in the natural world course. So there's already kind of just this energy going on to really connect these things together. And the students are really eager to hear it.
Okay. Well, with this, as someone who is not part of the Hindu tradition, my understanding is there's a lot of different paths and perspectives within the Hindu tradition.
Yeah.
And so, given that, how would you describe to non-Hindus how Hinduism approaches our connection to the environment and caring for it?
Yeah. Well, Hinduism, and first, the thing about Hinduism that's really important there's a couple of important things about Hinduism. One is that Hinduism is like a million different types of Hinduisms, that it's very much, I haven't described it as like an ocean of traditions. And of course, the term Hindu is both kind of a real, just kind of category of religious traditions in India, but also that term Hindu is only a fairly recent thing. So there's more, people talk about more like Dharma traditions or the Vedic traditions. The Veda means knowledge in Sanskrit. So the original texts that are behind many traditions of Hinduism are called the Vedas. And also it's important to approach Hinduism in a sense that you really want to try to learn from the original sources. Because unfortunately, India is still trying to kind of dig out under centuries of being colonized by other cultures. And a lot of the struggle with understanding Hinduism is trying to filter through some of these influences that still try to like twist Hinduism in a certain way, in a way that doesn't actually represent the voice of the indigenous tradition or the original traditions there. So I always try to learn more and more and more kind of from, and someone who like quote unquote converted to Hinduism, I'm always trying to be very respectful of, people who grew up in that tradition, who are Indian by birth, hearing from some of the original scholarly sources there. Not to say there's not people like myself in America or in Europe who can study Hinduism well, but you can kind of obscure some of the original sources of the tradition. But just I would say to people to approach the tradition with a tremendous amount of respect, because I mean, personally, it's the deepest tradition I've ever encountered. It's very ancient, and it provides a lot of just. And I think if you're coming at it from a different religious background, there's so many profound connections that are there too that can deepen your understanding of your own tradition too. So some people say Hinduism is not so much a religion as it is a way of life, and that's an interesting way to kind of approach it.
Sure. So you mentioned earlier in our conversation that within Hinduism is a sense of this of water being
Yeah,
sacred. So how does the tradition approach that understanding of, like, for example, water?
yeah. So as I mentioned earlier, like so I practice, as you mentioned, this Bhakti Yoga tradition, which is translated as the yoga of devotion. So in a number of the different Bhakti traditions, there is this sense that rivers, especially, are manifestations of divinity. So there's this whole tradition with certain sacred rivers in India, like the Ganges River. A lot of people know about the river Ganges in India, and other rivers like the Yamuna River, which those in the Bhakti tradition, that is for many, the way that some people will worship God, maybe in a church or in a temple. For a lot of the practitioners, their main connection with the sacred is through praying with the river, taking a sacred bath in the river, because they understand through the tradition and through the texts and through the rituals that the Ganges and the Yamuna are actually manifestations of the divine. And the kind of theology of the tradition is that these rivers, as goddesses, give everything that the devotee of the tradition desires through that worship. And through that, actually, just through that kind of like sensual encounter, like placing your body in the river and praying. So it's not this kind of like abstract thing. It's, and that's something I've done before too, where it's you take a sacred bath in the river, and it's said to kind of like clear your karma, and it's an act of worship. You're placing yourself in bodily connection with the rivers. And it really just, and that extends out to kind of other parts of the Bhakti tradition, which also looks at like trees as sacred, mountains as sacred too. So this is, and I was teaching my students this week, as kind of an example of what scholars call like animism, or the sense that there's the natural world is sacred and the natural world is the vessel through which we understand divinity. And animism is like there in Hinduism, it's there in Native American traditions, and it's also there in the Christian tradition too, with especially the Franciscan tradition. So, but especially in the Bhakti Yoga tradition, this kind of worship of rivers is a really, really essential thing.
It's interesting as you're talking, and you're talking about the specificity in some Hindu traditions of a river, a specific river, the Ganges River, for example. It strikes me as very, in some ways, a very place-based
Yeah,
tradition, and it reminds me of some of the conversations I've had with indigenous folks in the Great Lakes region, where their traditional lands, the land, that location itself is important, versus some Western traditions, like the Christian tradition, that tend to be a little more portable, as it were, in terms of
yeah,
some of the things. So this may be an unanswerable question, so I apologize if it is. But if you think about that place-based sort of sense of water in the Hindu tradition, is there a way to sort of approach that in the Great Lakes, in terms of that location, or how that might get translated into that place?
yeah. And this is, I mean, this is where I like going back to what I said earlier, where my experience of the lakes now has become deeper, because uh, in the very same sense that I would approach the Ganges River in India as being a sacred like manifestation of divinity, that's how I feel towards the Great Lakes. And um, I mean, there's some differences too. Like I may approach the Ganges maybe in a more specifically like ritualistic or reverential way. And my kind of relationship with Lake Huron is a place where like it's a place of play too. But in the Hindu traditions, the sense of play, which is what we call lila, is actually the like most sacred kind of manifestation of divinity. We perceive the divine as being very playful. So that's something too where I taken this kind of knowledge that I've had from my Hindu practice and brought this back into my own home place, and it's just kind of revealed to me the sacredness of the Great Lakes that is always there. And of course, I would love to learn more just from native nations that's their original lands in Michigan, kind of their own understanding of the sacredness of the lakes, because again, that's the original knowledge that's there. But that whole deep understanding of the sacredness of water, and that we actually directly like encounter and have intimate relationship with the divine through water, like that is something that's just I take with me every time I go to the lakes, and feel that too, and just become so appreciative of being a child of the Great Lakes, basically.
Mhm. Yeah. Well, I've certainly, I mean, in my own life, I've had those experiences where the lake was alive in a different sense than just at a biological level, you
Yeah,
know, and being there. So I can appreciate that. You know, we've talked a lot of, I mean, we've kind of, I mean, we focused, our conversation is focused on the Hindu tradition, but, you know, we've talked a little bit about Christianity, we've talked a little bit about indigenous traditions. And so it kind of brings me around to your work in comparative
yeah.
religions. Um, as I understand it, your dissertation was around anticipatory community and regenerative ecotheology.
Mhm.
So for a layperson like me, how would you describe that work?
Um, so this concept, yeah, thank you for asking. This concept of anticipatory community, I first encountered that. So my mentor is Larry Rasmussen, who is a Christian ethicist and theologian, taught at Union Seminary for many, many years. He has this amazing book, which I want to recommend, like very much. It's called Earth Honoring Faith, Religious Ethics, New Key, which came out a little while ago, about 2012, and it's just amazing book. It's kind of like what we all aspire for as scholars. You write your magnum opus at the end of your career, but also just like a really accessible and really like evocative book. And that's where he first talked about anticipatory communities, as these kinds of communities which are anticipating the way forward, and especially in an ecological sense in relation to the climate emergency that we now are increasingly living in. So there's a sense that these communities have a capacity to reimagine ethics, to reimagine practices, to reimagine values, to reimagine economy, in a way that is intentionally different and intentionally against where we're going, in terms of just the status quo, but not just against, but for a positive direction. And this term regenerative, which is very much a term that most, professional ecologists can describe this much more, I think, poetically than I might be able to. But some of us, I think, are a little suspicious of terms like green and sustainability, because sometimes those concepts can be co-opted to just kind of keep the status quo going. But regenerative, I particularly like because it just evokes how nature works, how the natural world works. There's these cycles of life, of passing, and in the passing of life is regenerated. I mean, just a simple act of, like, many of us compost now. We experience a garden, you compost and you throw out your banana scraps, and then you have soil eventually. And it's just like this regenerative energy, and many eco-theologians, feel this way, is just a manifestation of how the divine works within the world. And you can look at it that both like in a Christian sense, through like, if you're a Christian, you believe like in the resurrection of Jesus, but also in a Hindu sense, we talk about reincarnation as well. That you never really actually pass away or die. You are born again into another body. Therefore, we're always living in a way. So I just find that that kind of just the reality of regeneration to be a really important uh, way of understanding how we live together, and also I think if not a hopeful way, but at least a way that we can try to understand this moment that we're in which it feels like the world's ending practically every like 48 hours right now. And how do we regenerate this world that we're living in? And how do we regenerate the idea of being a human being in relationship to the world? I just think like, especially my Hindu practices have helped me to understand that, and then connecting that to my still existing Catholic side too. It's just like that experience of regeneration is so much part of our religious traditions as well.
It's interesting when you talk about anticipatory communities. I was thinking about a couple of folks I talked to, a couple of members of the Ojibwe Nation up in northern, or actually in Michigan, and
Mm,
Upper Peninsula Michigan, and they run a place called Dynamite Hill Farms, where they are, in a sense, I see them as, to hear your description, an anticipatory community trying to create a different way of being from the mainstream sort of Western way
yeah,
of operating. And so that's an exciting concept, I think, because I can identify different places around the Great Lakes where I can see that happening.
yeah,
You know, so that's
yeah. Yeah, and I would just say like that. For me, it's a helpful concept. Like I'm also careful. I'm not like I don't want to like. It's not a category to like impose on other communities per se. Like I'm always careful not to like do that. But like as you're doing, it's like a sense of like being able to actually see communities that are already doing this work and say, yeah, oh, this is kind of this is an anticipatory community. It's a very interesting concept that we all can like work with together. And I also think it's very similar to like what Martin Luther King Jr. talked about, the beloved community. It's a very similar concept. And then my Hindu teacher Rabnath Swami has his community in India is called the Govardhan Eco Village, which I did my research on, and it's just an amazing eco village project. And they do especially amazing work with a lot of the local farmers and villagers in Maharashtra and India near Mumbai, really trying to help them like regenerate their connection to the land. Because when you're poor in that part of India, it's just really hard, and you have to go and work in the city and become uprooted. So I think that's an essential part. When you see a community that's anticipatory, to me is one that's really rerooting back into place and helping others to do so.
well, we've talked about the place that environment sort of plays, or I should say that religious traditions play in caring for the environment. I kind of want to flip the question a little bit,
Mhm.
and I'm just curious your thoughts on the role that the environment plays in bringing religious traditions together. Does that make sense?
Yeah, totally.
Yeah. So
Yeah.
how do you see that?
Well, I mean, especially inspired by the work of Thomas Berry, and he is the author of. He's no longer with us in this form, but he the author of these books called The Great Work and The Dream of the Earth. That's his two most important works. And he just is really. I mean, I've been teaching him to my students at Iona the past few weeks, and I his whole kind of the whole thrust of his whole argument is that uh, to really understand the nature of religion and the connection between religions is that we have to gain meaning from the environment, from the natural world, from the universe. Many traditions around the world have not lost that connection to the universe and the natural world, but for various reasons over the last 500 years and all these kind of processes of colonization, industrial revolution, technological revolution, and the benefits those things did bring, but there was a cost of disconnection with the natural world, which and also can be a part of that cost is also kind of pitting religious traditions against each other as well. And Thomas is saying the universe, if we really reground our sense of meaning in the universe, that the universe is actually our source of sacred encounter and experience and meaning, then we can begin to really reconnect not only to the world around us, but also to other religious traditions too. And I think there's a grounding that's there, literal in a sense, and kind of like maybe like metaphysical too, in which you can really experience kind of the commonalities between different religious traditions. Because every religious tradition, every wisdom tradition has some sense of like deep connection to the universe and to creation. And for Christians, I always say, for my fellow Catholics, just look at the Franciscans. Read Pope Francis Laudato Si, his encyclical that came out a few years ago. Like it is deeply there. And the good thing is, amongst all the chaos of everything, is that this wisdom is always very accessible. Like, and that is something I think, if you were to ask what an ecotheologian does, part of their vocation is to provide this accessible, earth honoring wisdom to all people. and to show that it's very prevalent in all different religious traditions, and it helps us connect the common good of all different religions.
Well, that's great. I really appreciate that, Dr. Fici, and I really appreciate you making the time. This is some wonderful, wonderful stuff. Is there anything that we didn't touch on today that you just kind of want to add it here at the end, or?
Um, I know I would just this was great. I would just encourage. The same way I like try to encourage my students is to really just try to not just have this idea that the natural world is sacred, but actually experience it. Like I was telling my students the other day, like, sometimes we can kind of denigrate people as being like tree huggers, but actually you should go out and hug a tree every day because you're not going to be able to breathe without the trees. Um, and I would just also say, like, think about any body of water that is important to you. Try to experience that as a an encounter with the sacred. I think that's one of those very common experiences across religious boundaries, and really just whatever we can do to ground ourselves back into place is what's going to help us respond to this very challenging century we're living in right now.
Well, thank you very much. Thanks for making the time today. Good
Okay,
luck
yeah,
with the rest of your semester,
okay.
especially in these strange times.
Yes. Thank you so much.